Hi, everyone. Ryan is going to introduce the panelists, but I have the pleasure of introducing Ryan. Ryan Streeter is the executive director of the Civitas Institute. I think there were some additional words on that until very recently. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right. He was the executive director of something, but now he is the of something, and then at the Civitas Institute, he's now the executive director of the Civitas Institute. He's had a previous stint at UT Austin. He's been not a governor. He's been an advisor to, it says this in your bio, a president, a governor, and a mayor, and formerly was at the American Enterprise Institute. So Ryan, let me hand it off to you to introduce the panel.
All right, great. Thanks, Dan. And thanks to you and your colleagues for this day. Before I introduce Michelle and Ross, let me just give a shout out to Dean Ann Stevens and Pano Canellis, who were on the previous panel, because they are the co-sponsors and organizers of today's event. And especially Dean Stevens' staff, Dan Lear and the others who carried the bulk of the planning for this event. I think we should all just give them a round of applause here as we wrap up the day. Well, this has been a good event, and I'm glad that we're able to finish it with Michelle Goldberg and Ross Douthat here to close this out on a discussion titled, "Is Liberalism Doomed?" We'll end on this high note, and we'll look forward to the discussion. Michelle's been a columnist at the New York Times since 2017. And before that was at Slate, and has written for numerous other publications that you would know, like The New Yorker, and the New Republic, Newsweek, Washington Post, many other places. Her books have won numerous awards, covering topics as wide-ranging as Christian nationalism, the global battles over gender and reproductive rights, and wellness culture's relationship to Eastern spirituality, so quite a breadth there. Ross Douthat's been a columnist at the New York Times since 2009. 2009? Really?
I can't believe it either.
It's a film critic.
Things have just gotten better and better since I joined. That's what
Of course.
like a good luck charm for America.
That's right. Ross is also a film critic for National Review and previously was at The Atlantic. His 6-ish books have examined sociocultural decadence, the future of the GOP, the state and decline of religion, and his latest moving memoir of illness and suffering. So between the two of them, they've covered a wide range of topics, which means during the Q&A, if your question has nothing to do with anything we talk about up here today, I'm sure they have something to say to your question. They are regular sparring partners at the New York Times, and we are glad that they chose to bring their sparring here to join us. So we're going to talk about whether or not liberalism is doomed. And I'd like to just point out here at the beginning that this day has been really kind of a point-counterpoint, including last evening, kind of a point-counterpoint discussion. Here we have two very talented and well-known national figures to talk about whether liberalism is doomed, and I don't actually know what they're going to say. So we'll get there here in a minute. What I wanted to do to set this kind of in a historically contextual way is to suggest that this notion of whether liberalism is doomed or not is not necessarily a new concept. We've been here before. One of my favorite periods to dig into is 100 years ago, a period of time that I think maybe has been a little understudied in this regard, when you had a lot of anxiety in the 1920s about the future of liberal democracy in America. I have a couple of favorite hits from that era. One is someone who's been lost to history, but he was very well known in his day, a Baptist minister named Mordecai Ham, who was an early adopter of radio technology and filled circus tents with his traveling routine, who said on one of his radio shows in 1928, before the presidential campaign between Herbert Hoover and New York Governor Al Smith, if Al Smith is elected, it can be interpreted in no other way as a fulfillment of prophecy of the latter-day perilous times. So Al Smith wins the election, first rider of the apocalypse, I suppose.
But he lost.
But he lost, and so we didn't test the hypothesis. Unless you think this was just a grassroots phenomenon, you can look to someone like Irving Babbitt, a well-known humanist at Harvard University, who in 1924, exactly 100 years ago, said, "We seem to be reaching the acme of power." And he goes on to say that individualistic materialism is tearing us apart and makes us look like ancient Rome, but he says that's not the biggest problem. The bigger problem is, quote, "the unethical leaders who seek to advance the material interests of some special group at the expense of the whole community." This kind of illiberalism, he says, if it's as pronounced as he thinks, portends the end of our constitutional liberties and the rise of a decadent imperialism. Decadent imperialism was something that Irving Babbitt was actually fond of saying if you read his writings. So we've been here before, and the question is liberalism always almost potentially doomed? Did we recover from 100 years ago? Maybe you question the premises, but let's talk about how it looks today. And so we'll dig down a little bit and get into some specifics, but I'd like to actually just start a discussion off with the title of the panel. And on a scale of 1 to 10, how doomed is small L liberalism, that is the liberalism that has philosophical justifications and defenses on the left and the right, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not at all doomed, to 10 being, dude, we are totally doomed. Michelle, can I start with you? The state of liberalism.
Well, that's. I mean, I'm going to give you the most liberal possible answer and say 5. But I want to say the two examples you gave, including like Ham and his kind of anti-Catholic apocalypticism, makes it seem as if those warnings in the 20s were maybe a little bit silly and overwrought. But let's think about what happened in the 30s. Mm-hmm. Not in the United States, but around the world. I don't think that people who were issuing, kind of dire warnings about whether or not liberal democracy would survive in the 1920s were being hysterical given what followed immediately. And so, look, my own view is that liberalism is deeply imperiled. The only thing that gives me hope for its survival is the intolerability of all alternatives and their intolerability in practice. The fact that, sort of the one thing that typically inoculates a population against illiberalism, at least in the short term, tends to be the experience of it. I saw this very recently when I was in Poland, where there seemed to be an entrenched illiberal regime that was dislodged by a kind of democratic wave that very few people expected. But I do, things obviously are not looking great, certainly not in this country and in most of Europe. The fact that we have these elections coming up, the big question in Germany is about the advance of the AfD, the kind of party that is in some ways the heirs to the National Socialists, a party in Austria that's even kind of has even more direct Nazi antecedents, is likely to win their upcoming elections. Sort of everywhere you have everywhere I think that you don't have immediate experience of conservatism to, like in the UK, where there's kind of a lot of enthusiasm, or I don't know if enthusiasm, but a lot of eagerness for a return to a sort of traditional labor government because of their experience of the modern kind of right-wing populist parties in action. And I think that the reason that liberalism seems to be in retreat, and this is something that Ross and I there's probably some overlap in the diagnosis, if not in the idea of what to do about it, is that people find the burden of creating their own. People find the burden of kind of modernity and the need to create their own systems of values and create kind of their own lives. All of the things that liberalism promises is a huge burden at a time when there's enormous economic precarity, there's enormous social atomization, there's basically no consensus about the confines of reality or even what the confines of proper debate are. People feel, lost and at sea and lonely and are, I think, desperate for totalizing ideologies as opposed to just, kind of a list of procedural norms that you're supposed to navigate your way through. And so you see liberalism assailed from the far left to a degree within certain institutions, and then the far right, much more powerfully. But again, I think that no one has actually come up with an alternative to liberalism that people can really tolerate living under for very long. Or I shouldn't say that, because people tolerate living in Russia, they tolerate living in China. Nobody has come up with an alternative to liberalism that most of liberalism's critics could tolerate living under.
Or that people who already have lived for a long period of time in a liberal society would like to enter into, maybe, right? I think that's right. Numbers. So I'm going to cheat. And give you several different numbers, right? Because it depends
I didn't prohibit that.
You didn't prohibit that. That's right. And whatever is not forbidden,
make a note for next time.
Forbidden is permitted. I think if you're talking about liberalism, if by liberalism you mean the liberal world order that sort of we, maybe not all of us, but lots of people sort of saw as coming into being fully in the aftermath of the Cold War, a sort of a landscape of cooperation between nations, all of them tending towards the same general direction, some version of democratic capitalism with liberal constitutional norms, right? If that's your definition of liberalism, then I'd say we're at like 8 or 9 in terms of doom, right? Like that, the vision, sort of liberalism is globally is in retreat, and I think is likely to remain in retreat for the foreseeable future. If we're talking about Europe in particular, since Michelle spent a fair amount of time talking about the European situation, I do think the European situation is quite different from the American situation. I think there I would say more like 5 or 6, maybe 6, with sort of some overlap with Michelle's argument, but I think she underestimates maybe the extent to which there's a retreat from liberalism that takes both sort of populist authoritarian forms and a kind of managerial technocratic form, right? Where it's like the impulse that you see right now, for instance, in Germany of, this hasn't happened, but of people saying, well, the way to deal with the right populists in the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD party, is just to ban the party, right? And the proliferation of speech codes and prosecutions of people for their opinions in societies like France and Germany and Great Britain and Scandinavia, there's a desire to essentially illiberally preserve liberalism among sort of centrist technocrats that I think exists in a kind of dynamic political tension, but sort of also a kind of mutual reinforcement with the right populism of AfD or Viktor Orban or all of these figures. And I think given some of the sort of deep strains on European society, the combination of economic stagnation, really collapsing birth rates, and sort of pressure of mass immigration from Africa, I just think that both of those tendencies, both right authoritarianism and sort of technocratic illiberalism, are going to become more intense and more powerful as mechanisms for managing a sort of slow-burning crisis. Then for the United States, I guess I'll be more optimistic and give us like a 3, in the sense, especially if we're talking about, let's say, the next 25 years. So before before the AI god emerges and puts an end to all our petty, partisan disputes and tells us what we will teach in all of our universities, thus settling those questions forever, right? So just, pending sort of really dramatic technological and social developments, I just tend to think of America is more so than Europe and vastly more so than, China, Russia, South Asia, Africa. We're just a very liberal society. Liberalism in some form is deeply written in our cultural DNA. And that doesn't mean that we don't have sort of illiberal tendencies and authoritarian tendencies. It doesn't mean that, Donald Trump reelected couldn't provoke some kind of constitutional crisis. Or some other figure could provoke some kind of constitutional crisis. But at the end of the day, I have a certain amount of confidence that, there's just this strong American default to liberal individualism that would still survive on the far side of some sort of, crisis of governance, left-right collision, these kind of things. And I think just to end with an example, there was, Michelle and I spent a lot of time arguing about, the authoritarian threat of Donald Trump throughout his presidency. And obviously, when it ended with January 6th, I had to concede some ground to Michelle, though she was very gracious about it. She was like, "Well, it wasn't really a coup, Ross. I appreciated that. It's on tape. I think it's on tape." But there was at least some moments where I think the sort of fear of Trumpism had to concede some ground to the other side, particularly during the pandemic, right? When, was there ever a moment when a sort of, authoritarian personality had this opportunity to sort of, impose control and sort of, impose restrictions, impose some kind of imperial presidency? Surely it was, the arrival of a deadly pandemic from the People's Republic of China, right? And what happened during that period, it wasn't just that Trump was sort of temperamentally, not in the right place to sort of become the COVID-era dictator. It was also that conservatism, while it has plenty of illiberal tendencies, also in America just has this really intense libertarian streak that means that, once the pandemic was well underway, it was the right that became the great enemies of all restrictions and all sort of, all public health rules and so on, which in turn made it functionally impossible for any right-wing politician to sort of use that crisis to consolidate their own power and authority. And I did think that was sort of a telling example of just sort of, and there are versions of this on the left too, there's more sort of individualism and libertarianism in America relative to other parts of the world. And I think no matter what, that means that if you're doing a kind of numbers game, you would almost always rank America as the final domino to fall. If liberalism goes globally, it will go here last.
Can I just respond to the COVID thing? Because,
yes.
I feel like maybe we had this argument during COVID, but, the thing about COVID restrictions is that they fell on almost everyone in the United States. And I don't think that, people who worry, or me, I don't think that liberals who worry about right-wing authoritarianism think that it's going to be some sort of 1984 type situation in which everybody feels equally constrained and oppressed. I certainly do not think that an unconstrained Trump is going to want to significantly curtail the freedom of conservative white people in Texas. And so I don't know that the fact that kind of there was no widespread, the one place that you saw Trump use the pandemic was in terms of kind of curtailing asylum claims and changing immigration. And if there had, I'm trying to think offhand of a counterfactual in which Trump could have used pandemic restrictions to only target his enemies. But I think that because
he could have. Well, we probably don't want to go, but right. he could have sent out the National Guard to encircle New York City with a cordon sanitaire or something, right?
Okay, but I just think that again, I don't know that the nature of the pandemic, because you kind of didn't see this anywhere. You didn't see anywhere in. I'm trying to think of. You saw it, I guess, in China, but you didn't see, for example. Viktor Orban also didn't take advantage of the pandemic to vastly, kind of crack down on Hungarian society. I actually remember being in Budapest I can't remember now if it was 2021 or 2022, but it was at a point when it felt like kind of going through this looking glass where like all of a sudden nobody had masks, and it was as if there was no pandemic at a time when the rest of the world was very much not like that. And so again, I just don't think you can take that much comfort from the unwillingness to impose restrictions on everyone to then kind of extrapolate from that to say that, a Trump, who is surrounded by, National Security Advisor or head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Michael Flynn, and Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, is not going to do what they say they're going to do and, kind of create a network of internment camps and create, kind of pro-American curriculum in the universities and, again, fulfill all the other promises that they're making openly.
Okay, thank you.
We covered a lot of ground there.
Covered a lot of ground, and I do want to come back to some of these global sources of threats to liberalism a little bit later. But let's drill down a little bit more specifically here at home on a couple of issues related to illiberalism, and maybe we get the audience involved here a little bit. It's mid-afternoon. We're coming to the end. Maybe we can have a little bit of feedback to guide our discussion. So I wanted to talk about two issues. And let's just imperfectly define illiberalism as generally support for undemocratic forms of thought and governing of our polity, society, and economy, and think about it in two contexts which have come up today. So I'd like to see a show of hands. It might be good to, and I should also have said at the outset, if you can detect there's a bias in the framing of the panel, and that I, as the moderator, and I think my two interlocutors, we're pro-liberalism.
Well, I don't know. Is Ross? I mean, I feel like Ross can be a little cagey about this.
A little cagey. We'll come to this. I mean, judging by the way you described liberalism in America, I'd say you're all right. Well, don't let me put words in your mouth. Silence is.
I mean, I would not describe myself as a liberal. I would describe myself as someone who endorses Michelle's view that the existing alternatives to liberalism are worse, but I don't really share all of the philosophical premises that generally people associate with small L liberalism. I mean, again, it's like, it's this incredibly complex and vexing debate about what is liberalism, right? Like,
well,
you can spend 5,000 days arguing about whether John Locke was a liberal or not. But I'm certainly, I'm a little bit to the right of you.
I've known that for a long time. The only point I wanted to make is to say that, if you are, this is a university, it's a big tent, if you are a Gramscian Marxist making a long march through UT, or you're a Catholic integralist doing whatever it is you want to do for all of us, you're welcome here. But there's going to be this kind of bias towards preserving the liberal order, given all of Ross's caveats. But what I'd like to do is ask you, for show of hands, and I don't want people to be timid about showing their hands, so feel free to kind of look forward and up so that you have some sense that people can't see if you're raising your hand.
Just close your eyes.
But I will be taking notes on your on your troubling and problematic opinions.
So how many people here think that illiberalism is a serious problem on American college and university campuses? Okay, look up, people, come on. Okay, hands down. How many of you, second question, final one, how many of you think that illiberalism is a serious problem on the political right in America? Okay, wow, okay. All right, we got, I chose those two. I didn't ask about political illiberalism on the left. We could go there if people would want. I'm picking these two issues that over the last 4 months or so have been kind of the most prominently in the public square last fall. Lots of commentary about illiberalism on our college campuses, a lot of progressives distancing themselves from what they would call far-left progressivism, and then in an ongoing way, in particular more recently, the same thing about the political right, as Donald Trump has talked about Vladimir Putin in flattering ways and invited him to invade cheapskate NATO members, and talked at pretty much every rally about the January 6th protesters as heroes. So we have those two things have been getting a lot of commentary, and so now you've seen the show of hands. I'd like to ask both of you those in succession. We talked about this a little bit in the previous panel. When it comes to the seriousness of illiberalism on university campuses in America, what's your take on that?
So my sense is that, and I believe Anne said this, that some of what people talk about as illiberalism on college campuses is about peer dynamics, that there's kind of there are very few ways you can intervene in that without being even more illiberal. And so I think what you've seen on campuses is, kind of some styles of argumentation and, kind of obnoxiousness and closed-mindedness, some of it exacerbated by the internet and exacerbated by the involvement of kind of outside groups. And that has been both caricatured and then used as a pretext for a much more serious government crackdown on speech from the right. So, you have people on the left, for example, well, I think the debate over Israel and Palestine makes this really stark, right? On the one hand, you have people on the left shouting down, in some cases, Zionist speakers. You have a lot of complaints about students who are pro-Israel feeling ostracized by their peers. On the other hand, you have multiple overlapping government investigations of what professors who are critical of Israel are saying. And, similarly, you have something I think similar goes for critical race theory. You might feel some trepidation if you're a right-leaning student on certain college campuses saying that you believe in, say, like colorblind meritocracy. But what you have is the state banning huge kind of banning whole fields of inquiry, in some cases actual language, and cracking down on the academic freedom of left-wing professors. And so, again, I'll just quickly say, we were talking about New College at lunch. New College is this school in Florida that I've written about a couple of times because in some ways it's become ground zero for these debates. It was again, caricatured as this hotbed of wokeness run amok, which was never really accurate. And then you had the right come in and basically try to make it into a right-wing version of their own phantasmagorical idea of what the left was doing. And so now it really is a place where professors are kind of hired according to very strict ideological litmus tests, and where professors who had been there before are pushed out because they have unpopular political views. And I think that's sort of what's happening writ large, especially in red states.
I mean, I think there's, on the college question, we can talk about national politics. On the college question, I think a couple of different points. I agree with Michelle and with some of the comments in the prior panel, right, that some of what has changed are just social dynamics among students mediated by the internet and also by sort of in this kind of feedback loop with the internet has changed youth culture, I think, for the worse in profound ways that, may themselves doom liberalism eventually, just to literal extinction. But that is sort of somewhat separate from the questions of sort of university governance. At the same time, there has also been a kind of profound ideological consolidation, not at every school, but at a lot of elite institutions where there has been, over the last 20 years or so, just a sort of a disappearance of conservative professors and a sort of a slower but ultimately more important disappearance of the kind of centrist professors who were in left-leaning institutions actually the kind of rightward ballast, right? Like the token conservative professors mattered less than the larger group of centrist liberals. And you can, this again exists in kind of a feedback loop with national life where conservatism has become more populist, so intellectuals don't want to identify with conservatism, right? It's not just sort of, it's not just like purges taking place, it's also sort of people identifying in particular ways. But elite universities generally were left-wing 20 years ago and have moved substantially to the left since then. And then the third thing that's happened is that there has been the implementation in many schools, although these have been rolled back in some places, of tacit ideological litmus tests for new faculty, for faculty hiring in the form of diversity statements and related things that are, I think, functionally McCarthyite in their implications for academic freedom and intellectual diversity. And I think Michelle's reasonable points about the illiberalism of some of the political responses to what's happened on campus have to be seen in light of the pre-existence at many, many important American institutions of a requirement to make a statement of your ideological fealty to a particular perspective on the world as your only path to employment at these schools. I think if this had happened in reverse, right? If lots and lots of universities and conservative states had started saying, well, we're patriotic American institutions and we're only going to hire faculty after you make a patriotism statement. And we're not saying what kind of patriotism you can express. Maybe dissent is the highest form of patriotism. You can quote Pete Seeger lyrics if you want. We just are asking for you to say something about patriotism before you're hired. I think everyone would see that that was, again, sort of a functional ideological litmus test, no matter what the sort of notional freedom involved in. I think that's what's happened, what has happened over the last 10 years. And I agree with Michelle that some of the responses, the attempts to sort of ban particular fields of study are themselves illiberal in response. But I think there is sort of it's not just student culture, it's not just ideological shifts among the faculty, it has also been university policies, especially in blue states, essentially screening applicants for positions on the basis of their ideological commitment to progressivism.
Michelle, Ross gave America 3 after you gave your opening comments on the state of liberalism, or how doomed it was compared to the 5 of Europe and I guess the 7 or 8 or 9 of the rest of the world.
Let's say 6 for Europe.
Okay, we'll say 6 for Europe. When it comes to the issue of national politics and illiberalism in our politics, he's at a 3. Where are you on that? In terms of the second question I asked was about the threat of the political right when it comes to illiberalism. How seriously do you gauge that?
Extremely seriously. I mean, that I would put myself at an 8, just because we're basically the presidency. I mean, I understand this isn't really a partisan forum, but, we're basically a coin toss. And my sense is that even the 4 years that we already had of Trumpism took us much farther away from liberal democracy than I could have conceived of in 2015. But there's no reason to assume that 4 more years should be like that. And you kind of see this pattern in other countries, Poland, Hungary. In both cases, you had the right-wing authoritarian parties had sort of normal-ish first terms, got voted out, came back, and then were really able to consolidate power. And it seems to me that there's a lot of thinking going on the far right about how to avoid the quote-unquote mistakes that hamstrung, kind of authoritarian populism last time around, and they're likely to be much more effective going forward. And so it seems to me, it seems to me that we are, sleepwalking into the abyss.
Russ, you were going to respond, I'll let you just go. But there's checks and balances on that authoritarian impulse, or some of the tools that could be used that Michelle's referring to that you seem to have more confidence in.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think anyone should be, sanguine about electing Donald Trump to 4 more years as president. I think that Trump's sort of authoritarian impulses are made manifest daily in his public pronouncements. I think that was true throughout his first term, and it's still true today. And yeah, I mean, the President of the United States attempted to get his vice president to effectively return him to power in an election he had lost. I think all of that is completely reasonable grounds.
I was not trying to push you to
to push me to be anti-Trump. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, one of the sort of things that sometimes my readers or other people find annoying is that in the Trump era, I've spent a certain amount of time responding to arguments like Michelle's by saying, well, it's bad, but maybe it's not as bad as you think, right? Which is sort of a frustrating stance to take. But I guess I'm going to press Michelle sort of specifically on, what are the, you don't have to go all the way to a worst case, like second worst case or something. Like, what are the things that you can imagine plausibly being done in a second Trump term that would, let's say, push us towards, I mean, I think from your perspective, the kind of illiberal endgame in the US, the plausible one, is not totalitarian dictatorship, right? It's sort of a kind of managed democracy where Republicans, win almost all the elections because they've rigged the system, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, but I think it goes beyond that. I mean, again, I think that we should just go back and take Donald Trump at his word when he says that he wants to create a network of internment camps for millions of undocumented immigrants throughout the country, coupled with laws like the one that has only recently, that almost went into effect here in Texas, that would give law enforcement significant power to, kind of stop not just people who are undocumented, but anybody who might appear to be undocumented. I think the idea of, say, the National Guard coming into my city, New York, to look for undocumented immigrants, although I understand that the migration crisis has lessened some of Blue America's commitment to America as a nation of immigrants. Nonetheless, I at least like to think that in a second Trump administration, there would be some defiance in blue states. But again, I think you've heard Donald Trump say that they will send the National Guard into blue states to literally round people up. I mean, that's like the worst case scenario is that Donald Trump does what he says he's going to do.
But so I guess this gets to a sort of maybe a slightly different question, right? But it seems to me that there's a difference between a society where the government does things that are illiberal and a society that has ceased to be a liberal democracy, right? So in the middle of the 20th century, Dwight Eisenhower ran a mass deportation program with a name that, in the interests of not being reported to any university authorities, I will not quote the actual name of that deportation
program. Although I
believe,
I could be wrong, that Donald Trump has specifically cited that.
I would not be surprised. I think he has, right? So Eisenhower did that. It was, let's concede for the sake of argument that it was illiberal and sort of authoritarian and so on. But we don't look back and say that was the moment when American democracy died. We say that, politicians do illiberal things. I have some other examples from Democratic politicians of illiberal things. I expect that, I think morally the worst thing that Trump did in his first term up till January 6th was the child separation policy. Child separation policy, however, did not end American democracy. It was just a bad thing that the U.S. president did. So I think it's useful for critics of Trump to distinguish,
okay, so there's
are we fearing some policy or are we fearing a fundamental change?
Well,
that
I
makes
think
it impossible?
I think it's both, right? Because I think yes, I fear the policy, but I also fear, I think, what does it mean, again, for, say, the National Guard to descend on blue states and start kind of rounding people up and hunting people down against the, and kind of against the will of the people in that community. That's like a kind of a level of, almost occupation that is different from what we're talking about with Dwight Eisenhower, or even with the, indefensible network of internment camps that FDR, who's no one's idea of a non-liberal.
He's some people's idea of a non-liberal.
True enough. But I also don't think that that's the end of it, right? I don't think that that is all he's going to do. I think, something that you see, I would imagine something quite like what you see in Hungary and what the government tried to do in Poland, which was the transformation. And you don't have an exact analogy, right? Because our media landscape is just much bigger and more diffuse and is English language, so it's just not going to be as limited as Hungary. But, you kind of see the transformation of public media into something like InfoWars in Poland and Hungary. You see the persecution of people who own media companies to either sell their properties or just, sort of get out of the business altogether if they don't want to toe the government line. And again, I think I want to go back, but I just want to go back to universities, because I think that when Donald Trump talks a lot about, kind of instituting a kind of pro-American curriculum, on the one hand, you might find some sucre assuming that you don't actually want patriotic loyalty oaths in your university, in his, kind of lack of follow-through in the past. But you also have people in conservative states who are really eager to get rid of tenure, get rid of traditional protections for academic freedom, turn the university into a patronage system for conservative apparatchiks. And, and again, it's never, I think that if you look at other places where you've seen liberalism either partially or fully collapse, it's never one thing, right? It's a congeries of changes large and small that eventually makes kind of both the free exchange of ideas and the free campaigning for an alternative more and more difficult.
Do you want to?
If you have something to say, go for it.
I'm
going to drill down a little bit.
I was just going to say that it is important, though, to recognize that we did, in the 4 years that Donald Trump was president of the United States, the mass media did not, under pressure from Trump, become more right-wing. It became more left-wing. Silicon Valley, under pressure from Trump, did not become friendlier to right-wing populism. It, in fact, specifically sort of cooperated with liberal there was a clear attempt. We can argue whether it was a justified attempt. There was a clear attempt by powerful companies in Silicon Valley to sort of play a kind of truth policing role in the 2020 election that was, tacitly helping Joe Biden win re-election. Generally, I would just say that Trump, again, in those 4 years, it wasn't just that he had very little to no success in moving sort of the civic life of America in a kind of right populist direction. It was that the reaction went the other way, to the point where if we had a friend of mine on here who is to my right and more pro-Trump, he would say, oh, actually, what Trump revealed is that the real threat to liberalism is, social media companies colluding to suppress negative stories about Democratic politicians, right? Okay. And I'm without...
So I understand that we don't want to argue specifically about whether Twitter was right to suppress a single New York Post story for 36 hours, which is what happened and which has become the basis now for
37 and a half hours.
Which has now become the basis for multiple hearings and also the wholesale transformation of Twitter/X into a cesspool of right-wing demagoguery, misinformation, and outright Nazism. And so I think that the fact that you had some of these bulwarks in the past is encouraging, but they have now been systematically eroded by Trump and his allies, not just, in terms of kind of founders and the like have moved to the right and because they have been repelled by what they call wokeism. But there's also been, again, like multiple government hearings into the content moderation decisions that these platforms have made that have, I think, made it clear that it is unsafe if they want to continue operating to kind of make decisions about foreign propaganda operations that would lessen the salience of pro-Trump propaganda.
Okay, let's move off the front pages of the New York Times and go down ballot a little bit, and talk about states. And we will allow enough time for questions here. I want to make sure that all of you have a chance to ask questions. But in the past few years, there have been a lot of heated activities at the state levels as well. And I wanted you to comment on whether these are signs that liberalism is actually functioning as it should, or whether you see them as threats to liberalism. Let's give a couple of examples. You have locally elected school boards making decisions about curricula and what can be on and off curriculum, which seems to be the job of schools and local school districts. And post-Roe, you now have a number of states writing their own rules on abortion, and there's a lot of debate about that. So where you see what most people might see as a restriction of rights to read or teach anything that you want, or right to access to an abortion, what's your take on what's happening at the states right now in these very controversial issues? Is this a sign of the same kind of thing you're worried about nationally, Michelle, or is it something different?
Yes.
And Ross, I'm interested, obviously, in your take as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a sign of the same kind of thing I'm worried about. And often you will find illiberalism saying, well, we're just talking about the freedom of local communities to impose their own rules on, and their own restrictions on their members. And there's obviously something to that. The extent to which kind of individual freedoms are completely traduced and people have the rights to self-determination, completely subordinated to, if not, kind of the state at the national level, to the state in Texas. When we were at lunch and people were talking about Austin being a nice place to live, which I certainly agree. I mean, I cannot imagine being willing to go through a pregnancy here knowing that if something goes wrong, as things regularly do in pregnancy, that I would have to, not just seek care elsewhere, but also be really careful to cover up any digital trail as I made my travel arrangements and, kind of sought medical advice. And I think that what we're seeing now, again, I think if it was not just women, it would be obvious that there's a level of surveillance and oppression and interference with bodily autonomy that is quite unprecedented in modern America, and even actually unprecedented in pre-Roe v. Wade America, because in pre-Roe v. Wade, you had abortion bans, but you didn't have, you had actually quite a bit of latitude. Doctors had quite a bit of latitude, even if women did not. And so, you didn't have murder prosecutions for, or attempted murder prosecutions for stillbirths, miscarriages, and you certainly didn't have doctors being unable to treat women who were in the middle of miscarriages if there was still a heartbeat. I believe I just recently read a case here in Texas of a woman who was denied treatment for an ectopic pregnancy, which is insane. And again, to go back to worst case scenarios, Ross and I used to have a podcast called The Argument, and we had these long running arguments where, I was typically the one who was kind of hysterical and saying that all kinds of terrible things were on the horizon, and Ross was the one who was saying, you know, even if you believe what you believe, and we have very different views on abortion, that things aren't that bad, they're not going to go that far. And I think that things, in terms of what a post-Roe America looks like, I think it vindicates all of us hysterical feminists.
I would just say quickly, I don't agree, but I don't think we should turn this into a debate about abortion policy. I would just say that from my perspective, both of these cases, both abortion policy and sort of arguments about curricula at the level, both at the level of local school boards and at the level of arguments about, what influence the state legislature should have over what gets taught at UT Austin. Those are both, normal features of liberal democratic politics, that, you have contestation over the rights of women versus the rights of unborn children. You have contestation over who has power over curricula in institutions funded by taxpayers and run for the public benefit. I think that, I don't know, I think there is a tendency in sort of defense, what you might call like the, defenses of liberalism discourse, to say that liberalism means, the removal of certain issues from democratic politics. And I mean, and
But
that—
Ross, don't you believe that certain issues should be removed from, if not democratic politics, from majoritarian or electoral politics? I mean, you believe in some zone of personal autonomy and kind of whether or not the majority decides that, papacy is a looming threat to the republic.
I mean, maybe I look forward to the day when the papacy is a looming threat. No, kidding, don't. Chatham House rules. Chatham House rules. I think I have a narrower view of what those issues are generally, and I'm sure there are some cases where maybe you could sort of find some hypocrisies or inconsistencies, but generally I think the pattern of the last 20 years has been that liberals have sort of have wanted, not, I don't want to say liberals, I want to say sort of part of progressivism, not even all of progressivism, but a meaningful part of progressivism has regarded the success that liberalism had, that cultural liberalism had with the same-sex marriage debate, where you had a sort of elite consensus joined to judicial rulings that helped move public opinion in a particular direction, where this big victory for cultural progressivism was won, basically through sort of elite consensus in a judicial process, right? That this is sort of, I think a number of progressives saw this as a model, basically, that you could take a larger number of issues, including immigration, and sort of treat them as outside the realm of democratic politics. I think with immigration, this has actually been happening, was sort of true in Europe for many decades, and Europe is sort of reaping the consequences of trying to treat immigration as sort of a purely technocratic issue that democratic majorities, didn't necessarily get a say about. So, yeah, I mean, I generally think that it is better for the democracy part of liberal democracy, but also for the liberal part in the long run to have more issues fought out. Sort of, I mean, it's not that experts and bureaucrats and judges don't have power and don't have a place in this contest. Sometimes sometimes the angry parents on the school board wins, and sometimes, the educational bureaucrats win, right? Like that's, and you're getting, very different rulings on abortion in state courts around the country. You're getting, I mean, it's not just a question of, let the people vote and so on. There's a lot of different actors and stakeholders who make up a liberal society. But I do think that, it is not a sign of the collapse of liberal democracy that, state legislators are arguing about curricula in public universities. I think that's just sort of a normal part of what liberal democratic politics looks like.
Very good, thanks. We are going to have some time for questions, and so I'll invite those of you who would like to pose a question to Michelle or Ross or both to start making your way to the microphone. And as you're coming up, I'll just ask you both a quick question. It's a big one, but we'll try to do it briefly. We kind of skipped over this at the beginning. When it comes to the sources of threats to our liberal democratic order, Ross, you mentioned earlier economic stagnation, declining childbirths, mass immigration. When it comes to what's happening both here and around the world, maybe there are different reasons. When you think of the biggest things generating what we've seen over the last 7 or 8 years when it comes to threats to our liberal order, what are the sort of biggest sources of that as you see them? Because I never specifically asked you to lay out your view on that.
I would go back to what Michelle said at the outset, right? This idea that liberalism always has a problem of people feeling sort of abandoned to themselves by its, that it sort of opens up all these horizons of freedom, but then people feel atomized and isolated, and this in turn reliably produces both right-wing and left-wing critiques of liberalism. Both the Marxist and the reactionary critique of liberalism start with this idea that liberalism sort of leaves people too much alone. It leaves them at the mercy of capitalist depredations. It leaves them, at the mercy of sort of atheism and despair and so on. I think that's always an issue for liberalism. And I do think that sort of especially in the last 10 or 15 years, a set of changes, many of them rooted in, this device and the way people sort of experience the internet, has made that problem more severe. Like I think people are just kind of unhappy, even within not just like it's not just the sort of right-wing populists who are unhappy. Like liberalism when Barack Obama was elected president, like. I work for a liberal institution. I hang out with liberals. I know what liberal culture is like. Liberal culture in 2008 was like, look, we have some problems in the world, but it was mostly just George W. Bush was an idiot, maybe a Christian nationalist. We got rid of him. Things are going to be good. Technology and technocracy and progress and sexual liberation, all of these things are going to work well together for the future. And I think it's just been a long time since even within liberal culture there was that kind of optimism. I think there's a lot of pessimism, a lot of sort of despair about the future that's connected to real world issues. It's connected to the rise of right-wing populism, right? Like if there is a sort of like anxiety and fear just driven by Donald Trump himself, but I think it's also connected to technology, to secularization, and also sort of whatever comes after secularization, which would be a weirder conversation that we can have later.
Next year.
Next year, I'll come back for the UFOs and ayahuasca panel.
I can't wait. That's going to be awesome.
Oh yeah. Oh, it will.
I mean, I agree with most of what Ross just said. I mean, I think that the one place we're probably in almost total agreement is about the corrosive, the kind of socially corrosive effects of social media and the kind of epistemological chaos that it creates. The only other thing that I would add is the effect of kind of extreme economic precarity, in the sense that you just sort of cannot build a stable foundation for your life. And I think that has, that creates a huge amount of what the kids call black pilling on the left and the right? The sense that, in a sense, when we talk about kind of defending liberalism, we're in some sense defending maybe not the current shaky status quo, but yes, the America of, the halcyon days of 2009. And
there was some economic precarity in
yes,
2009,
okay, right, okay, let's say 2008.
Yeah.
But
early.
Yes, but
the Democratic Convention.
Yes, that was as good as it gets.
Yes.
That was actually, my kids always ask me, Mama, what was the happiest day of your life? And I always say, like, the day you were born. But the truth is, it was the day that Obama was elected.
Chatham House rules. Chatham House rules.
Chatham House rules.
But yes, I do think that the sense that kind of liberalism has no answers for the kind of deep despair and insecurity that people feel, but also that there's not really like I said, I mean, I don't really believe that there are alternatives, and I'm not sure that very many other people truly believe in those alternatives either, because something you don't see on the left, you might see a lot of, kind of performative Marxian language. You don't actually see, kind of planning for a viable future. It's more a sense that, that the kind of the present is so intolerable that we'll kind of deconstruct it and see what happens.
This has been great. This has been a great discussion. It's been a great symposium. And I'd like to thank Michelle and Ross for joining us today, as well as all the other panelists and speakers that were here as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.